Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing stories ever to come out of the dark mountains of Pennsylvania. Please leave a comment about where you're watching from, because this story will cross borders and touch something deep inside each of you. This video is not real. It was made up for fun. It is purely coincidental that any resemblance to real people, living or dead. In the Appalachian Mountains, where thick fog covers the valleys and the silence feels heavy, there is a place that time has forgotten to erase. We are talking about a remote part of Pennsylvania where the trees are so close together that sunlight can hardly get through the twisted branches. That area was even wilder and less developed in 1914 than it is now, when civilization was starting to spread across the rest of the country. Clara Whitlock came to that area from Pittsburgh with only an old leather suitcase and secrets that no one could ever fully understand. She looked like a normal woman, but her eyes had something deep and unsettling that made people uncomfortable when they looked at her for too long. She rented a cabin on a hill that was far away from other people. It was surrounded by old pine trees, and in the winter, the wind howled like voices from the past. People in the closest village, which was made up of wooden houses separated by miles of narrow trails, started to notice strange things. Clara only went to the store once a month, always at dusk when the dirt roads were already starting to get dark. She didn't buy much food, but she did buy a lot of coarse salt, candles, and dark fabrics. Herbert, the store owner, tried to talk to her, but she only answered in one word, paid with old coins, and then disappeared down the trail before anyone could ask her any questions. The first few weeks were marked by an unsettling silence coming from that cabin. Even on the coldest nights in October, there was no smoke coming from the chimney. There was no sound of life and no movement in the windows that were covered by heavy curtains. But then things took a turn. A faint, flickering light started to show up in the early mornings, always between 2 and 3, when even the animals that lived there at night seemed to stay away. A lumberjack who worked nearby said he heard strange chants echoing through the woods. The words were in a language he didn't know, and the melodies made his blood run cold. He told this story in the village saloon, and other people said they felt the same thing, a heavy presence in the air, as if the forest itself were watching and waiting. People started to talk about things in whispers because, back then and there, some things weren't talked about openly in broad daylight. People didn't see Clara very often, but when they did, she smelled like herbs and wet dirt, as if she spent her days digging or handling plants she didn't know. She always had stains on her hands, but they weren't just dirt. They were something darker and more stubborn. When someone asked her what she was doing alone in that cabin in the mountains, she would smile in a way that didn't reach her eyes and say something about studying plants and doing research on the local flora. But the truth, as is often the case in stories like this, was much worse than any logical explanation could cover. And we are just starting to figure out this mystery that happened in the Appalachians, where secrets grow as thick as the plants that can't be seen through. There was something wrong with the way Clara Whitlock's cabin was built. People who walked by said that the shadows around it moved in a strange way, as if they were following their own rules. The wood on the outside walls had strange marks on it, like deep grooves that made patterns that no one in the village could understand or explain. The Appalachian Mountains were covered in a quiet white blanket of snow during the harsh winter of 1915. This made Clara's presence even more mysterious. She had planted a garden in the back of the house, but nothing grew there like it was supposed to. The plants came out twisted and with colors that weren't found in the area, like dark purple and almost black-green. Some of them smelled strange, which drew in strange bugs that the area's older residents didn't know about. Herbert, the store owner, wrote down everything his customers bought in a notebook. It was an old habit that helped keep track of the credit given to the people who lived there. Clara's purchases made for an ever more worrying list. thick glass jars, braided hemp ropes, small, round mirrors, pots of wild honey, and a lot of beeswax. He also noticed something else. She bought every old book that came into the store, no matter what it was about. She bought volumes on primitive medicine, treatises on minology, and old astronomy manuals. In March, one afternoon, a traveling saleswoman came through the village as the thaw began to turn the trails into rivers of mud. She came from a bigger city with news from the outside world, fabrics and household goods. She said that while she was there, she saw Clara's hut in the distance and felt something that made her change her path on purpose. She said that the air around that place felt heavier, as if something invisible was pushing against the chest of anyone who got too close. But there was someone who knew Clara better than the other residents. This person kept his own secrets and knew how heavy silence could be. Thomas Mercer lived alone on a property next to Clara's. There were only a few kilometers of thick forest between their cabins. He was a hunter and knew every trail, rock formation, and hidden spring in the mountains. And it was Thomas who started to notice things that other people didn't. The animals were staying away from a certain part of the forest that made a nearly perfect circle around Clara's land. The deer that used to eat there were gone. Rabbits and squirrels had changed the paths they took. When they crossed that space, even the birds flew higher. Thomas knew nature well enough to know that this wasn't normal. He could tell that something big had changed in the balance of that place. Thomas saw Clara walking through the forest one night while he was checking his traps nearby. She had a lantern that gave off a blue light. She moved with purpose, stopping at certain places to look at the ground, the trees, and the sky, instead of the usual orange flame. He followed her, but stayed back, his mind torn between curiosity and caution. Clara stopped in a small clearing where the full moon's light came through the trees. She then began to draw something on the ground that was covered in dry leaves. They weren't Christian symbols, and Thomas didn't recognize them from his own beliefs. Thomas came over to look at the drawings after she was done and left. There were circles inside of circles, lines that crossed at exact angles, and marks that looked like they were pointing to the stars above. He tried to remember them, but the more he looked, the more confused he got, as if the patterns were changing in his head. He felt dizzy and had to lean against a tree to keep from falling. Thomas decided that night that he needed to know what really happened in that cabin in the mountains. That choice would change everything, not just for him, but for everyone who lived near the Appalachian Mountains, where old secrets never really die. They just wait in the depths of the forest. It wasn't easy to scare Thomas Mercer. He had fought bears on icy trails, lived through storms that knocked down trees that had been standing for hundreds of years, and crossed rivers that were so fast that they could have swept away anything in their path. But Clara Whitlock's presence brought out something different in him, a restlessness that came from a deeper, more primal place than his body. He watched over the next few weeks, not in a way that was obvious, but with the patience of someone hunting in the mountains. He saw that Clara had set up a strange schedule. Every week, she would go down to a certain stream with ceramic jars at dusk. For hours, she would sit on a smooth stone and stir something in the water with her hands, moving them in a circle all the time. The water she brought back to the cabin was milky, which was very different from the clear water that came from the local springs. The village started to notice small changes, nothing big or easy to see, but there was something in the air. People didn't sleep well. They woke up from dreams they couldn't fully remember, just bits and pieces that faded away like mist in the morning sun. The blacksmith said that his joints hurt and that no medicine helped. The pastor's wife had a dry cough that wouldn't go away for weeks. Little problems piled up, tools that broke for no reason, food that went bad too quickly, and pets that ran away without a word. Herbert stopped writing down what Clara bought in his notebook. He would shake his head and change the subject when asked about it, as if talking about that woman might draw unwanted attention. But one afternoon in April 1915, when Thomas went to the store to buy gunpowder and salt, Herbert quietly pulled him aside and said something that made the hunter's blood run cold. Clara had asked about old cemeteries in the area. She wanted to know where the old burial sites were, the ones that belonged to the first settlers, and the communities that had disappeared decades before when diseases or harsh winters killed off whole villages. Herbert had tried to answer in a vague way, but Clara had pushed him so hard that he felt uncomfortable. She wanted coordinates, descriptions, and any other information about sacred land that had been lost to time. Thomas was familiar with these places. He had stumbled upon some during his hunts, found moss-covered gravestones, rotten wooden crosses leaning at odd angles. He didn't go to those places because he was afraid of them. He did it out of respect. Even in places that had been left behind, there was something sacred, a memory carved into the ground. 2 nights after that conversation, Thomas woke suddenly. There was no sound, no movement, but something had jolted him from his sleep with irresistible force. He dressed quickly, grabbed his flashlight and his shotgun, and followed an impulse he couldn't explain. His feet led him along the familiar trail, but this time toward the oldest cemetery in the region, a place called Whispering Hollow by the few who still remembered its existence. When he reached the top of the hill overlooking the small valley where the cemetery was located, Thomas saw a faint light among the trees. Clara was there. She moved among the ancient graves with her bluish flashlight, stopping before each legible tombstone, touching the earth with her bare hands. She wasn't digging, at least not in the physical sense of the word, but her gestures had something ritualistic about them, a ceremony executed with absolute precision. Thomas approached silently, using all his hunter skills to avoid detection. He hid behind an old oak tree, close enough to hear, but protected by the darkness. Clara was talking to herself, or at least seemed to be alone. Her voice was soft and almost musical, but the words were not English or any other language that Thomas knew. Then she did something that made every muscle in his body jump. Clara reached out over a specific grave, one of the oldest where the name on the marker had already been completely erased by time, and the earth began to move. Not violently, not as if something were emerging, but rippling gently like water disturbed by an invisible breeze. The vision only lasted a few seconds, but it was long enough for Thomas to know that he was seeing something that went against everything he knew about the natural world. He retreated slowly, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest, and when he was sure the distance was sufficient, he ran. He ran through the forest as he hadn't run since he was young, ignoring branches that scratched his face, rocks that threatened to twist his ankles. He ran to his cabin and locked the door, knowing that flimsy lock wouldn't offer any real protection against whatever Clara Whitlock truly was. The next few days felt like they went on forever. At the end of the night, Thomas Mercer tried to convince himself that he had made it all up, and that the darkness and tiredness had played tricks on his mind. But rationalization didn't help. He knew the difference between what was real and what was an illusion, between the trick of light and shadow and something that was truly unexplainable. Spring was coming to the Appalachian Mountains, bringing wildflowers and the return of migratory birds. But the beauty of the season seemed fake, like a decorative veil over something rotten. Thomas started to stay away from some parts of the forest where he thought the air felt different and the silence was too thick to be real. And the more he stayed away from them, the more he wanted to know what they were up to. It was like a mental itch that couldn't be scratched. Clara still went to the warehouse once a month, but her behavior had changed in a small way. She smiled more, said hello to people with small nods, and even said nice things about the weather. It was like she was practicing how to be a person by trying out the right movements and facial expressions. Herbert noticed, and this bothered him more than her silence before. Those gestures seemed too rehearsed, like an actor who is still unsure of their role. During one of these visits, Clara casually said she was looking for someone who knew a lot about the area and could show her around the mountains. She talked about old rock formations, secret caves, and places where the geography made things strange. She paid well, real silver coins, which were hard to come by in that part of Pennsylvania at the time. A neighbor, who sometimes worked as a guide for city hunters, told Thomas the news. The man was thinking about taking the offer because the money was too good to pass up. Thomas had a knot in his stomach. He knew he had to do something, but what? What did he see in the graveyard? Who would trust him? He could hardly handle it himself. Thomas made a choice that night. If Clara wanted to know more about the area, he would be the one to tell her. It's better to be nearby and watching than to let her walk around with someone who didn't know what she was going through. Thomas followed the trail to the lonely cabin high on the hill the next morning, before either courage or common sense stopped him. In the light of day, the place looked different, maybe less scary, but in a way that made everything even more unsettling. The plants in the back garden had grown a lot, reaching heights that seemed impossible for that time of year. The leaves were intertwined in patterns that looked like the symbols he had seen drawn on the forest floor. It looked like the glass in the cabin windows had been polished with something that changed how light passed through it, because the sky looked strange in the windows. Thomas knocked 3 times on the door. The sound echoed, empty, and deeper than it should have. There was a brief moment of complete silence, and then light footsteps could be heard coming closer. Clara opened the door, and for a split second, Thomas saw something cross her face that he couldn't name. Then she put on that practiced mask of politeness again. She asked him to come in. Thomas stood on the edge, his gut telling him to go back, but he pushed himself to cross that line. The inside of the cabin was surprisingly bare, with only a few pieces of functional furniture. The walls were covered in papers, including detailed drawings of constellations, hand-drawn maps with notes in different languages, and complicated diagrams that looked like they combined geometry with something alive. Clara gave him tea. Thomas agreed and watched her every move as she made the drink. Her hands were soft but strong, and they moved quickly because she did the same thing over and over again. She didn't ask him why he was there. She just waited, as if she knew he would come eventually, as if this whole dance were part of a script that had already been written. Finally, Thomas spoke up. He said he knew about her search for a guide, someone who knew the mountains better than anyone else in the area. Clara tilted her head and looked at him with those deep eyes that seemed to see right through his skin and bones and into his thoughts. Then she smiled, and there was something real in that smile, something that made her look sad. She said yes to his offer, but only if Thomas was ready to see things that would make him question what he thought he knew about reality. He had to be willing to keep what he saw completely secret, and he had to know that once he started that journey, there would be no going back to the comfortable ignorance he had lived in until then. Thomas agreed, not because he was ready no one could be, but because the other option was to live with the weight of unquenched curiosity and the fear of the unknown haunting his mind like a hungry wolf. So, inside that cabin, lost in the Appalachian mountains, the hunter and the woman, whose secrets were deeper than any cave in the mountains, made a deal. 3 days later, on a morning when the mist covered the valleys like a quiet white ocean, the first expedition set out. Clara showed up on Thomas's land with a worn canvas backpack and a dark wooden staff that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of wood, with no visible seams or flaws. She was dressed for long hikes in clothes that were useful, but Thomas couldn't put his finger on what it was about them that made them seem to soak up light instead of reflecting it. For the first few hours, they walked in silence along trails Thomas had known since he was a child. Clara paid close attention to everything, stopping now and then to look at a rock formation, the way moss grows on a certain tree, or the way a stream flows. Her observations were not just those of a nature lover. There was a method to it, a system of classification that Thomas didn't get, but could feel in the way she moved. When the sun was at its highest point, Clara asked him to take her to Echo Rock, a strange rock formation where sound acted strangely, coming back not once but many times, with each echo being a little different from the last. Thomas was familiar with the area. He had played there when he was younger, pushing the limits of that strange natural sound. They got to the site in the middle of the afternoon. The echo stone was a huge piece of dark granite that stuck out from a steep slope. It was like a shallow cave or a natural shelter. The strange sounds were caused by the way the rock was placed in relation to the valley walls, which made an imperfect resonance chamber. That was the explanation that Thomas had always believed. Clara walked up to the rock formation with a sense of awe. She put her backpack on the ground and started to take things out of it. There were small, shiny metal bells, ceramic bowls, and packets of dried herbs tied with thin cords. She put everything in a circle around her, with each item perfectly placed to within a millimeter. Thomas watched from a distance, both fascinated and scared at the same time. Clara then started to sing. It wasn't music in the usual sense. It was something between singing and reciting, with words flowing in a way that seemed to change structure with each verse. The sound bounced off the stone, making it louder and creating harmonies that were impossible. And then something amazing happened. The echoes not only came back, but they also answered, not with the same words, but with different ones, as if the rock itself were talking. Thomas felt the air get thicker, but not in a way that he could see or understand. It was like layers of reality that couldn't be seen were getting thinner and clearer. Clara kept going for several minutes, her voice steady and her posture tense. When she finally stopped, there was complete silence. The normal sounds of the forest had stopped completely. She looked at Thomas and had tears in her eyes, but they weren't sad tears. It was more complicated than that. It was a mix of happiness and sadness, victory and defeat. In a soft but firm voice, she said that she was looking for places where the world was thinner, where the lines between what we know and what we don't know were less clear. There were other places like the Echo Stone in the Appalachian Mountains. Why? Why look for these cracks in reality? Thomas asked. Clara sat on a smooth stone and stared at the horizon for a long time, where the mountains stacked up on top of each other in different shades of blue. Then she started to tell her story, or at least part of it. She came from a long line of people who had studied the world's hidden patterns and the invisible currents that flow beneath the surface of life. She made it clear that it wasn't magic, at least not in the way that fairy tales do. It was more like a lost science, a way of understanding natural forces that people had given up in favor of easier, more comfortable explanations. Clara said she was mapping these powerful places, writing down their features and keeping knowledge alive that was fading away as the world became more modern and people stopped listening to the Earth's whispers. It wasn't work that would get you recognition or thanks. It was a lonely mission that was often misunderstood and sometimes dangerous. Thomas heard everything, but his mind was torn between doubt and acceptance. Part of him wanted to dismiss it as a complicated fantasy, but another part, the part that had seen the earth ripple over old graves and felt the change in the air around Clara's cabin, knew there was truth in those words, even if it went against everything he had been taught about how the world worked. As they came down the mountain, the sun began to paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Clara casually mentioned that she needed to visit other places, like caves where the temperature stayed the same all year, clearings where plants grew in perfect spirals, and springs whose waters never froze, even in the coldest winters. She needed Thomas's help to find them, though. He agreed, not just because he was curious, but also because he knew that Clara was doing something important that went beyond the small limits of fear and superstition. He respected her dedication, even though he didn't fully understand it. Thomas lay in bed that night and looked up at the wooden ceiling of his cabin. He knew that his life would never be the same again. He was no longer just a lone hunter in the mountains of Pennsylvania. He had become a secret keeper, a witness to mysteries, and a friend to someone who saw the world in a completely different way. And this realization made them both excited and a little scared all the time. Once you see beyond the veil, you can never act like it doesn't exist again. The trip was just getting started, and the Appalachian Mountains had a lot more to offer than Thomas had ever thought possible. The next few weeks turned into a strange and interesting routine. Thomas and Clara went back to the Appalachian Mountains with a new sense of purpose. They went to places he had only seen briefly before, but now they had new layers of meaning. Each trip revealed things that made people question what they thought they knew about reality. Small miracles hidden in the folds of the familiar landscape. There was a cave 4 hours' walk from the village. Thomas had only been there once when he was a child, and then never went back for no reason. When Clara said she wanted to explore it, he felt that same old reluctance come back, but he pushed it to the back of his mind. They left on a cloudy May morning in 1915, when the air was thick with the promise of rain that never came. The entrance to the cave was hidden and hard to see among the rocks covered in moss and thick plants. Clara stopped at the opening and took a deep breath, like a swimmer getting ready to jump into deep water. She turned on a flashlight, but the flame that came up had that bluish color that Thomas had learned to recognize as a sign of her rituals. As they walked down the narrow passage, the sound of their footsteps echoed strangely off the damp stone walls. Inside the cave, there was a huge natural hall. The stalactites on the ceiling looked like the teeth of a huge animal, and the floor was covered with a thin layer of crystal-clear water that made the flashlight's light dance in patterns. Clara was more interested in the marks on the walls than anything else. They weren't cave paintings in the usual sense, but deep grooves carved into the rock that made complicated geometric patterns that changed slightly from one part of the hall to the next. Clara walked up to a certain wall and touched the grooves with respect. She ran her fingers over the patterns, as if she were reading a language that could be felt, figuring out messages left by people she didn't know when. She whispered that those symbols were very old, older than any Europeans who lived in the Americas, and maybe even older than the native tribes that lived in those mountains. Thomas was interested in how she worked. Clara took some paper and charcoal out of her backpack and started to carefully draw the patterns. Her hands moved so quickly that they almost looked like they were taking pictures. She continued to draw as she explained that these symbols were not maps of physical territory, but maps of energy flows, of invisible currents that ran through the earth like veins carrying blood through a living body. Thomas looked around the hall while Clara worked. There were smaller passages that led off from the main chamber. Some were too narrow to walk through, and others went down at steep angles to unknown depths. He found something that made his heart race in one of these side passages. They were bones, but not human bones, which made him feel better. They were from a big animal. They were arranged in a way that didn't seem natural, in a circle around a shallow hole in the rocky floor. He called Clara, and she came right away. She looked at the arrangement for a long time, moving her head from side to side like a bird looking at something interesting. Then she said something that made Thomas's skin crawl. This was a place of offering, but not to the gods of any religion he knew. It was something more basic and direct, an attempt to talk to the most basic forces of nature through carefully planned symbols and gestures. Clara didn't touch the bones. She only took a mental picture of the scene, remembering every detail. She said that throughout history, some people have known that some places were very important because they were where different parts of reality came together. No matter what their culture or time period, these people developed similar ways of doing things, as if they were all following some kind of instinctive knowledge. Clara wrote down what she saw, and Thomas watched for hours in that cave. Slowly, he started to see the patterns she saw. It was like learning a new language, where at first everything seems random. But as time goes on, patterns and meanings start to show up. The grooves in the walls weren't just random decorations. They were instructions, diagrams, and maps of something that went beyond words. The day had gone on for a long time by the time they finally came out of the cave. The sun was low in the sky, and the trees cast long shadows. Thomas blinked against the light and felt confused, as if he had been in that underground world for days instead of hours. Clara looked full of energy, and her eyes shone with the happiness of someone who had just solved a hard puzzle. She talked more openly about her job on the way back. She told me that she was putting together a kind of atlas, not of real places, but of important places where the line between the ordinary and the extraordinary was less clear. Her main goal was to keep this information safe for future generations, for those who would come after and be able to understand and value it. Thomas asked her why she had chosen the Appalachian Mountains in particular. Clara smiled that sad smile that he was starting to know. She said that those mountains were very old, unlike most other geological formations. They had seen many different times, survived big changes in the weather, and watched species come and go. This old thing left marks and made sounds that someone with training could hear and understand. They stopped to rest by a stream where the water was clear and the stones were smooth. Clara filled her canteen and gave Thomas some, which he gratefully drank. The water tasted clean and had a mineral taste that is typical of springs in that area. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest at dusk, the birds getting ready for bed, and the wind whispering through the trees. Thomas understood that his view had changed in a big way. He still saw the same trees, stones, and streams that he had known for years. But now he was aware of something else, something that had been out of reach before. It was like looking at a painting and suddenly seeing things that had always been there, but that he had never really noticed. Clara could tell that he was different. She said that some people are naturally good at this and just need to be awakened to their sensitivity. She said that Thomas had this skill, most likely because he had spent so much time in the mountains and had developed a deep connection with that place through years of quiet observation and full immersion. They started walking again as the forest began to get dark. Thomas knew every trail by instinct, even as the sun began to set. But now he saw things he hadn't noticed before, like how some trees grew slightly tilted, all pointing in the same direction. How some parts of the woods were quieter than others. Not because there weren't any animals there, but because of some strange sound quality, and how the temperature changed for no apparent reason in certain places, with pockets of cold or hot air. When they finally got to the fork in the road where their paths split, Clara lightly touched Thomas's arm. She thanked him for being there for her, for being open-minded, and for helping her. She told him that there were more places to explore, more mysteries to document, and that she was counting on him to keep working with her. Without thinking, Thomas agreed. It was no longer a question of fear or curiosity. It was something deeper, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time, a connection to something bigger than his life alone in the mountains. Thomas lit a candle that night and sat by the window in his cabin, looking at the stars in the dark sky. He thought about the cave's markings, the bones that were arranged in a circle, and the patterns that Clara saw in everything. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was part of something important, and that his life had a purpose beyond just getting by. The Appalachian Mountains were not just his home, they were a living book, pages written over millennia, waiting for someone with the patience and sensitivity to read them. Summer arrived in the Appalachian Mountains, bringing humid heat and electrical storms that illuminated the night sky with primal fury. Thomas and Clara intensified their explorations, taking advantage of the long days and lush vegetation that made the forest even denser and more mysterious. Each expedition revealed new layers of complexity, as if the mountains were gradually sharing secrets guarded for countless ages. During one of these journeys in mid-June 1915, Clara mentioned a specific place that appeared repeatedly in her notes, but which she had not yet been able to locate. She called it the Silent Circle, based on fragmented descriptions she had found in ancient texts and second-hand accounts she had collected over the years. According to these sources, it was a perfectly defined circular area where no sound penetrated or escaped, as if the very acoustics of the world had been switched off in that specific space. Thomas had never heard of such a place, but something in the description vaguely resonated in his memory. There was a region in the mountains that he instinctively avoided during his hunts, not because of apparent danger, but because of an inexplicable unease. It might have been connected. He told Clara where it was, and she immediately knew that the general coordinates were what she was looking for. The next morning, they left with enough food and water for 2 days, just in case they had to camp. The path took them through rougher and rougher land, up steep hills covered in huge ferns, and across narrow streams where the water was so fast that it foamed white against the rocks. Thomas noticed that the further they went, the scarcer the animal life became. There were no birds singing, no squirrels scurrying among the branches, not even insects buzzing around. Around midday, they arrived at an area where the forest changed character. The trees grew more spaced out, their trunks curiously twisted, as if they had grown trying to avoid something in the center. There was a thick layer of dead leaves on the ground that didn't seem to break down like normal. They kept their shape and color even though they had clearly fallen seasons ago. Clara stopped abruptly, raising a hand to signal silence. Not that Thomas needed the warning. He had already noticed. The silence was absolute, in a way that defied experience. It wasn't just an absence of sound, but something deeper, as if the very concept of sound had been removed from that space. When Thomas tried to speak, he saw his lips move, but no sound emerged. It was so disorienting that it made me feel sick. Clara gestured for them to proceed carefully. Even though there were dry leaves on the ground, they walked slowly and quietly. As they approached the center of the area, Thomas began to feel other effects. It felt like gravity was pulling him at a slightly different angle, which changed his sense of balance. His hands tingled a little, not enough to be uncomfortable, but definitely there. There was a low rock formation in the middle of the circle that looked like a natural altar made of dark gray stone. The mineral veins in the stone shone faintly even in the dim light that came through the trees. The rock's surface was surprisingly smooth, as if many people had polished it over the years. Clara walked up with respect, her eyes wide with wonder. She took off her backpack and began to work methodically. She first drew the exact outline of the quiet circle with a compass. The needle of the compass moved around randomly in the area but worked normally outside of it. The circle was about 20 meters across and had a very precise shape that couldn't have been an accident. Clara made small cuts on the trees around her that she could find again if she needed to. After that, she started to look at the main rock. She took out small brushes and measuring tools from her backpack that Thomas had never seen before. She carefully cleaned the stone's surface, which had been covered by lichens and time, to show markings that had been hidden. They weren't the same symbols they had found in the cave, but they were similar in style and had a common visual language that made it seem like they came from the same place. Thomas was very interested in how Clara worked. She wrote down everything in great detail, making detailed drawings, taking exact measurements, and writing down her thoughts in a leather-bound notebook that she held in her hand. Her focus was absolute, like a surgeon during a delicate procedure. She spent hours writing down every little thing about that amazing place. Clara finally motioned for Thomas to come closer. She had discovered something specific in the central rock, a perfectly symmetrical circular depression about the size of a human hand. A pattern of smaller symbols around it made it look like it was glowing. Clara put her own hand in the hole, and it fit perfectly. There was nothing going on for a while. After that, Thomas noticed a change. The silence, which was already complete, somehow got deeper. It was like more layers of reality had been taken away, leaving only the most basic parts of life. Thomas saw Clara close her eyes and her face became very focused. He couldn't hear her, but he knew she was saying something. Even though the words were silent and had meaning, the feeling lasted for maybe a minute, but it was hard to tell how much time had passed in that place. When Clara finally took her hand out of the hole, she stumbled a little, and Thomas instinctively moved to catch her. She nodded that she was fine, but Thomas had never seen her eyes shine with that much emotion before. He knew something important had just happened, but he didn't know what. They slowly left the quiet circle, and when they crossed the invisible line, the world burst into sound. Birds singing, the wind rustling leaves, and the distant sound of running water. After the complete silence, everything seemed louder, almost painfully so. Thomas needed a few minutes to get his nervous system back to normal, so that he could process sensory information normally. Clara looked tired but happy. She sat on a rock, covered in moss, drank from her canteen, and then gave it to Thomas. He drank gratefully, still trying to make sense of what had happened. He thought his voice sounded strange when he finally spoke, as if he hadn't used it in days instead of hours. He wanted to know what had happened when she touched the rock. Clara thought about the question for a long time before answering. She said that some places, like the Silent Circle, worked as different kinds of portals. They weren't physical portals to other places, but rather portals of perception, or windows that let you see things about reality that most people can't. She could get to something she called a memory of the place when she touched the stone in the right way. Not memory in the sense of specific events, but something more basic. A feeling of everything that had happened in that space over time, condensed into a form that could be felt, but not easily put into words. It was just information, with no language or preset ideas getting in the way. Thomas tried to get it, but it was like trying to hold water in his hands. The idea kept slipping through his mind every time he thought he understood it. Clara saw that he was upset and put a soft hand on his shoulder. She said it was normal and that you couldn't learn this kind of thing directly, only by doing it. With time and practice, he would learn how to get to these deeper levels of reality on his own. That night, they camped close to the Silent Circle, but not inside it. Clara, who had a lot of experience and knowledge, also respected that space too much to treat it lightly. They made a simple camp about 100 meters away, where the forest went back to how it usually is. As they sat around a small campfire, sharing dry food and hot tea, Clara talked more about her trip. She said that she had spent more than 10 years doing this work, traveling to different areas to find places that were important to her. The Appalachian Mountains had a lot of these kinds of places, but she had also found them in other parts of the world. Each one was different, but they all had some basic things in common. Thomas asked her why she did this and what the end goal was. Clara stared at the flames as they danced, their orange light lighting up part of her face. She said she thought the world was losing something important, a basic link to deeper parts of life. As people became more modern, technology took the place of intuition and simple scientific explanations took the place of accepted mystery. These connections were being broken and forgotten. It was her job to keep knowledge alive before it was lost forever. She made it clear that she didn't want to slow down progress, but she did want to make sure that something important wasn't lost in the rush to adopt the new. There was space for both logic and intuition, as well as science and mystery. But people were forgetting about this balance, and she was afraid of a future where people completely lost touch with these deeper parts of reality. Thomas listened quietly, with respect. He understood, maybe not in a logical way, but in a deeper way. He had spent years in the mountains watching how even that faraway place was changing. More and more people were coming, bringing with them new ideas, technologies, and ways of thinking. Not everything was bad, but something was being lost in the process. As the night went on, they talked about a lot of things. Clara told stories about other places she had been and other mysteries she had written about. Thomas talked about his life in the mountains and what he had learned from nature through careful observation and years of experience. They learned that even though they came from very different backgrounds, they had a lot in common, including a respect for the unknown and a sense of humility in the face of things that are bigger than human understanding. When they finally went to bed, Thomas lay in his sleeping bag and looked at the stars through the trees. He thought about the quiet circle and how it made him feel like reality was getting deeper, like layers were being peeled away to show something more basic. He knew that his life would never be the same again. He had crossed an invisible line and could never go back to the comfortable ignorance of before. Summer had come to the Appalachian Mountains, bringing days and nights that were so hot that the air stayed thick and hot. Thomas and Clara kept exploring, but now they moved with a different sense of urgency, as if they both knew that something was coming, some unavoidable end they couldn't yet name. People in the village started to notice the strange relationship between the lone hunter and the mysterious woman who lived in the cabin on the hill. When Thomas went to the general store, people whispered behind his back. People looked at him with interest as he walked along the dirt roads. Herbert, the owner of the store, tried to start a conversation a few times by asking casual questions about what they did in the mountains for so long. Thomas gave vague answers, talking about exploring caves and documenting local plants, which were half-truths that didn't really say anything important. Someone else was watching with a less innocent interest, though. Reverend Blackwood came to the village at the start of summer with an evangelical mission that promised to save souls and make the community better. He was a tall, thin man with sharp eyes that looked like they were looking for hidden sins in everyone he met. His sermons were full of passion and often talked about the dangers of witchcraft, heresy, and the dark paths that led people who didn't know better away from salvation. Thomas went to one of these sermons because he was curious, but he left feeling bad. The Reverend's intensity was fanatical, and there was no room for subtlety or mystery. Blackwood saw the world as clearly divided into light and dark, good and evil, with no room for the many shades of gray that really do exist between the two. It was as if Clara had a sixth sense for avoiding trouble, because she never showed up in the village when Blackwood was there. But the minister had heard about her, the strange woman who lived alone, bought strange things, and stayed up late. He didn't name names, but during a very fiery sermon he talked about evil forces hiding in the shadows and pagan practices that were ruining the Christian land. Thomas felt like those words were a direct attack on him. That same night he looked for Clara and climbed the path he knew to her cabin. He saw her in her garden, taking care of the strange plants that had grown in a messy but strangely harmonious way. She smiled at him in a mysterious way, as if she had known he would come. He told her about the preacher, the sermons, and how the village was getting more tense. Clara listened without saying anything, and her hands kept moving in a smooth, practiced way as she pruned and rearranged. She just nodded when Thomas was done, as if she already knew what he was saying. She said that this happened all the time. No matter where she went, someone would eventually show up who understood that she was different, and that she stood for something beyond their limited view of the world. And these people, whether out of fear or a real desire to protect their communities, acted aggressively. She had to pay that price for her work. It was an unavoidable result of living on the edge of what is known and what is not known. Thomas wanted to know if she was scared. Clara stopped what she was doing and looked right at him. Her deep eyes reflected the dim light of the evening. She said that fear was always with her, but not in the way Blackwood thought. She wasn't afraid of going to hell or getting punished by God. She was afraid she wouldn't finish her work, that she wouldn't be able to save the knowledge before it was too late, and that she would waste the time she had left on petty fights with people who would never understand. Clara showed Thomas her real work that night. She led him inside the cabin to a room he had never seen before. It was behind a door that looked like it was part of the wooden wall. The room was small, but everything was in its place. There were shelves on all the walls that were full of notebooks, maps, jars with plant and mineral samples, and wooden boxes with very clear labels. Clara opened one of the notebooks for Thomas. Her neat handwriting, detailed drawings, and complicated diagrams filled the pages. It was a complete record of years of exploration, with each place written down with scientific accuracy and artistic sensitivity. It wasn't just a bunch of facts, it was a carefully crafted story that had meaning and context. She said that she had made many copies of everything and put them in different safe places. The knowledge would still be there if something happened to her. There were other people all over the world who shared her goal and would know how important those records were. It wasn't completely solitary work, but it was part of an invisible network of people who were preserving things. Each person worked alone, but they were all working toward the same goal. Thomas looked through the notebooks with respect, knowing how big of a deal it was that Clara had done what she did. Those pages held decades of work and solved mysteries that would have been lost forever. Even though it never got any public recognition, it was an impressive legacy and a big contribution. Then Clara asked for something unexpected. If something happened to her, she wanted Thomas to keep working. Not right away and not in the same way, but when he was ready, if he ever was. She had taught him so much in the last few weeks that he had become more aware of things he didn't even know he had. He could improve his own skills and find his own way to keep the secrets of the mountains he called home safe and sound over time and with practice. Thomas felt the weight of that duty, but he also felt something else: pride in being seen as worthy of such trust. He agreed, not because he fully understood what he was agreeing to, but because he knew it was the right thing to do. Clara talked about her work in detail, explaining how she did things and sharing tricks she had learned over the years. They talked for the rest of the night. Thomas paid close attention to everything, asking questions, clearing up any confusion, and memorizing as much as he could. It was a lot of focused learning, like they both knew they didn't have much time left. When Thomas finally made his way down the trail to his cabin, the sky was already turning pink and gold as the sun rose. He was tired, but full of energy, with a mind full of new information and unexplored options. The mountains around here seemed different now, not in how they looked, but in what they meant. He was just starting to learn how to read the stories that every stone, tree, and stream told. The next few days were tense. Reverend Blackwood made his sermons stronger, and his words became more specific and accusatory. He never said Clara's name, but anyone who was paying attention could tell what he meant. A small group of people who were already afraid of things that were different and didn't trust things they didn't know started to form around him. Thomas tried to help in a quiet way by talking to people he knew and trying to plant seeds of reason and tolerance. But he found out that logic was not a good way to fight fear. People wanted easy-to-understand answers to questions they didn't understand, and Blackwood's stories gave them that. Clear comfort, even if they were wrong at their core. Clara kept working, seemingly unaffected by the growing hostility, but Thomas noticed small signs of stress. She checked the trails more often and always had her backpack ready to go if she needed to leave quickly. He knew she was getting ready to leave, but he wanted to finish as much as he could before she had to go. On a hot August afternoon in 1915, the tension in the village reached a breaking point. The sky was full of dark clouds that looked like they were going to rain, but they never did. Thomas was in the storehouse getting supplies when he heard people yelling outside. He could see a group of villagers gathered around Reverend Blackwood through the dusty window. The diffuse light coming through the thick clouds made their hard faces look even harder. Herbert walked up to Thomas with his hands on his dirty apron, feeling nervous. He said in a low voice that Blackwood was planning a trip to Clara's cabin and that it was a Christian duty to stop evil before it spreads. The group planned to leave at dusk with Bibles and crosses in hand, not weapons, because they wanted to get rid of what they thought was a spiritual threat to the community. Thomas felt a cold feeling in his stomach. He knew that kind of passion. He had seen it before in other places and at other times. When fear turned into group action, the first thing to go was reason. He quickly paid for his things and left through the back door to avoid the group on the main street. He had to tell Clara to give her time to think about what to do next. The climb up the trail they knew so well had never felt so long. Thomas made himself keep a steady pace to save energy while his mind raced. Maybe he could get Clara to hide for a while until things calmed down. Or maybe it was time for her to leave for good and find a new place to work without anyone bothering her. He got to the cabin out of breath and saw Clara in her garden. But there was something different. She wasn't taking care of the plants like she usually does. She was standing in the middle of the garden, perfectly still, with her head tilted, as if she were listening to something that only she could hear. When Thomas called her name, she turned slowly, and there was something in her eyes that he had never seen before. There wasn't really fear, but a kind of quiet acceptance of something that had to happen. Clara raised a hand gently before Thomas could explain what was going on. She said she already knew. She had sensed the shift in the air and the anger building up like pressure before a storm. This wasn't the first time she had been in a situation like this, and it probably wouldn't be the last. But this time there was something different. She felt like this fight meant something special, like it was part of a bigger pattern that she only partly understood. Thomas begged her to leave right away so they wouldn't have to fight. But Clara shook her head gently. She had to do one last thing before she could leave. Explore something she hadn't finished yet. During her last trips to the mountains, she had felt something there that she couldn't quite put her finger on. It was stronger than anything else she had ever seen, and it was in a remote area that Thomas had only briefly talked about before. She told him where it was, and Thomas knew it right away. It was the most remote place in the local mountains, a place he didn't go to often. He had always been hesitant to go there because it felt like he was entering a place that didn't belong to him. It would take Clara at least 2 hours to get to that place, and that's if they could move quickly. Thomas stared at the sky and thought about it. If they left immediately, they could reach the location. Clara could do what she needed to do, and they would still have time to return before Blackwood and his group arrived at the cabin. It would be hard, but not impossible. He could see that Clara was determined, so there was no way he could convince her to give up. They left in tense silence, moving quickly but carefully along the rough paths. Clara only brought a small backpack with her most important tools and left most of her stuff behind. She had moved her most important notebooks to safe places over the past few weeks, as if she had known this would happen. That afternoon, the forest looked different. It seemed thicker and the shadows were deeper. Even though the day wasn't over yet, the animals were silent. No birds sang, no squirrels scurried among the trees. It was as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for something big to happen. They arrived at the spot as the sun began its final descent toward the horizon. It was a natural clearing, surrounded by steep cliffs on three sides, forming something like an amphitheater created by ancient geological forces. The grass on the ground was strangely uniform, which is not what you would expect from that area. There was a rock formation in the middle of the clearing that looked like an exposed spine. Its surface had been worn down by erosion, which made patterns that were almost hypnotic. Clara walked up slowly, taking her time with each step. Thomas could feel something emanating from that place, an almost subliminal vibration that touched not his ears, but some sensory organ he didn't know he possessed until he met Clara. The air had a different texture, thicker but simultaneously lighter, as if the normal laws of physics were slightly distorted in that specific space. She began her ritual with practiced movements, establishing her working circle around the central rock formation. This time, she used no physical objects, only precise hand gestures as if she were drawing in the air itself. Thomas watched with interest as the light around her acted strangely, rippling and bending in ways that couldn't be explained by normal, natural events. Clara then placed both hands on the central rock and closed her eyes. What happened next was too strange to put into words. The light around her intensified, not coming from any specific source, but as if the air itself were luminescent. Thomas felt more and more pressure, not physical, but in a way that was clear to him. It was like being in the presence of something huge and old, a mind that went beyond what people could understand. Clara stayed still for a very long time. Thomas had no idea how long it had been. It could have been minutes or hours. He saw expressions cross her face, emotions too intense to name, as if she were experiencing multiple lives condensed into single moments. Tears streamed silently down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away, totally absorbed in whatever experience she was going through. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the intensity diminished. The light returned to normal. The pressure dissipated, and Clara staggered backward, only Thomas's quick reflexes preventing her from falling. She was pale, trembling slightly, but her eyes shone with something beyond mere satisfaction. It was ecstasy mingled with sadness, understanding mingled with loss, as if she had seen something transcendent but knew she could never fully convey it to another person. She spoke in a hoarse voice, words coming out with difficulty, as if she were relearning how to use human language. She said she had made contact with something ancient, a presence that had existed in that place since before humans inhabited those mountains. It wasn't an entity in the conventional sense. It didn't have individual consciousness as people understand it. It was more like crystallized memory, knowledge condensed into an almost physical form, echoes of events and forces that shaped not only that geography, but the very structure of local reality. Thomas helped her sit on a smooth stone, offering her water from his canteen. Clara drank eagerly, her hands still trembling slightly. She explained that she now understood the ultimate purpose of her work, seeing how all the pieces fit into a larger pattern. The places she had written about weren't just strange spots, they were part of a huge network that stretched all over the world. They were places where different parts of reality came together and kept a fragile balance that kept physical existence stable. And that balance was changing, not in a bad way, not in an apocalyptic way, but slowly, as people grew and changed the land and cut off old ties. The patterns were shifting. It wasn't a question of good or evil, it was just going to happen. But it was important to write down what it was like before, so that the memory of a setup that would soon only exist in records could live on. Thomas listened to all of this with a mix of sadness and admiration. He knew that he was seeing the end of an era, not in a dramatic way, but in a deep way that meant everything was changing. And Clara had spent her whole life waiting for this moment of change, building a bridge between what was and what would be. They finally started to go down when the sun was touching the horizon. Clara moved slowly, clearly tired from what had happened, but there was peace in her movements, as if she had accomplished her goal. Thomas stayed close by, ready to help her if she needed it. His mind was busy processing everything he had seen and heard. They saw smoke coming from the chimney when they got close to the cabin. Not the smoke that Clara would make, but something thicker and darker. There were lit torches all around the property, and people were moving around in the growing shadows of twilight. Blackwood and his group got there earlier than Thomas had planned, and it seems they chose not to wait. Clara stopped on the path and watched the scene from a distance. There was no surprise on her face. It was the same calm acceptance that Thomas had seen before. She turned to him and gave him a small leather-bound book that he knew was her personal notebook, the one where she kept all of her important notes. She told him to leave and not get involved in what was about to happen. At least in that part of her journey, her work was done. What happened next was just an inevitable ending, a result of living on the edge of two worlds. But Thomas had a different future ahead of him, with responsibilities he had agreed to and knowledge he now had. He had to take care of himself in order to keep doing the work his own way. Thomas wanted to protest and stand by her side, ready to face whatever Blackwood had in store for them. But Clara didn't back down. She knew the risks and accepted the consequences when she chose this path. She didn't need a martyr or a rescue to share her fate. She needed him to live, to remember, and to eventually tell others what he had learned, people who would be able to understand. She hugged him for a short time, which was surprising coming from someone who is usually so quiet. Then she let him go and started walking toward the cabin. Even though she was tired, she stood up straight and walked with purpose. Thomas stood on the path, holding the leather notebook tightly to his chest as he watched her shadow move through the darkening sky toward the torches and distant voices. Thomas stayed on the path while Clara went into the shadows, where the darkness quickly swallowed her up. He felt like the leather notebook was much heavier than just a bunch of pages of paper. It was a legacy, a duty, and a physical reminder of everything she had learned in those life-changing months. He chose a different path, one that would take him back to the safety of his own land. The storm that had been threatening all day finally came. Thunder echoed through the valleys as the rain fell in heavy drops that washed over the paths and soaked the dry ground. Thomas lit a candle and opened Clara's notebook that night, when the storm was raging outside. Her beautiful handwriting, careful drawings and notes filled the pages. They didn't just record facts, they also recorded feelings, impressions, and the things that couldn't be seen about each place they had been together. It was both a work of art and a record of her discoveries, with each entry showing not only what she had found, but also how deeply it had affected her. There was a note on the last page just for him, thanking him for being there, being open-minded, and looking beyond appearances. She had written that she believed he could keep observing the mysteries of the mountains and keep the knowledge they now shared in his own way. "The places remain, waiting for those who have eyes to see," was the last sentence. Thomas climbed to the cabin on the hilltop when dawn broke and the storm had cleared the sky. There was nothing in it. Clara had left, taking only what she needed with her and leaving behind the space she had filled during those busy months. The windows were shut, the door was locked, and the air was still, which made it seem like this chapter was over for good. The garden she had worked so hard on would start to grow wild. The exotic plants would slowly mix with the native plants or die off with the seasons. Someone else would eventually move into the cabin, or it might stay empty and become just another forgotten building in the vast Appalachian mountains. Thomas never found out for sure what happened that night. He didn't know if Clara had left on her own before the fight, if she had made a deal with the people who were looking for her, or if she had just vanished like she had come, leaving only memories and questions. And maybe it didn't matter to know the exact details. What was left was the knowledge she had shared and the lessons about how to see the world in a new way. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. People in the village slowly got back to their normal routines and started to worry about everyday things again. The tale of the strange woman who lived alone in the cabin on the hilltop became just another story that people told from time to time, and the details got less clear over time. But Thomas remembered what he had learned. He kept exploring the mountains, but this time he saw things differently. He noticed patterns and connections that he had missed before. He went to the silent circle from time to time and sat there in awe, where sound disappeared. He went back to the echo stone and listened to its impossible harmonies. He wrote it down in his own notebook in a way that was not obvious, using the language Clara had taught him. This kept observations that would have been lost. The years went by slowly in the mountains. The seasons went through their usual cycles. Trees grew and made new ones. Streams kept moving through the valleys without stopping. As the years went by, Thomas grew older with grace, and his ties to that place grew stronger. Eventually, he met someone who was really interested and had an open mind. This person asked questions that didn't have easy answers, and Thomas, remembering how Clara had shared what she knew, started to teach, but not all at once. He planted seeds that could grow into deeper understanding. The Appalachian Mountains still keep their secrets. The mysteries are still there, waiting for people who look beyond the surface, hear beyond the obvious, and feel the invisible connections that make reality into patterns that are more complicated than most people think. They are in hidden valleys and ancient caves, in silent clearings, and in rock formations that are hard to explain. And somewhere, maybe other people like Clara are still working quietly, recording, preserving, and witnessing the dance between the known and the unknown. Stories like this never really come to an end. They only change, like the sounds of the echo stone echoing through time, never fully going away. The mountains are a reminder. The places are still there. And for those who are willing to listen, the secrets still whisper through the old trees, the clear streams, and the wind that blows through the deep valleys. Leave a comment if this trip has made you want to learn more about the mysteries that might be around us. Sign up to get more stories that look at the amazing things that happen in everyday life. Until next time.